This was the first tank to feature a cannon mounted in a rotating turret and was the most widely produced tank of the First World War. And while totally obsolete by 1939, large numbers were still in service all over the world when the Second World War started. Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. I'm Tom and this is the Tanks of World War II video series. This episode kicks off our sub-series looking at the tanks of the 1940 German invasion of France. And we start off with the Renault FT tank. Now, you might be thinking, I thought you said this was tanks of World War II, not tanks of World War I. And you would be right. The FT was, of course, a tank designed and deployed by the French during the First World War. However, this was such a successful and widely used design that many were still in service at the beginning of World War II, despite the fact that they were almost completely obsolete by this point. Now in this episode, we're going to be talking about the FT tank within the context of the Second World War. So that means there's a lot of stuff having to do with World War I and the interwar period that I'm going to leave out or go over very briefly. In particular, this tank was used by so many countries, I don't really have time to go through all of them in detail, nor do we have time to talk about the combat record on the FT in the First World War. Now, the technical description will be fairly short since, frankly, it's such a simple vehicle, there's not that much to describe, really. So that'll give us a little more time to talk about the overall strategic and tactical picture of the 1940 campaign, which is part of the reason I'm starting with the FT for this French 1940 series. The Renault FT went into service in 1917 and was the brainchild of French military theorist and officer General Jean-Baptiste Estienne. It's often referred to as the first modern tank design, although frankly I've always thought that description is a little overstated. That said, it is the first vehicle to establish the conventional tank layout of the driver in the front, engine in the rear, and a rotating turret in the middle of the vehicle. Now the Renault FT was quite small compared to most of the tanks that had preceded it, which were all rather large vehicles with multiple guns mounted in sponsons or sticking out through openings in the hull. Now the heavy French tanks of the period, the Saint-Chamond and the Schneider, were not very successful, being based on the Holt tractor chassis and lacked sufficient mobility in the mud and trenches of no man's land during World War I. Also, they were very vulnerable to enemy artillery fire, being relatively few in number and large targets on the battlefield, particularly as the Germans, as an anti-tank measure, started to move field pieces closer to the trench lines. Now, General Estienne's idea was that a large number of smaller light tanks could swarm the battlefield and would overwhelm the enemy's anti-tank defenses. Due to the limitations of the French wartime economy, he needed a design that would be light and small if it were to be manufactured in large numbers. This is due to shortages of high-powered engines and armor plate. Now, after getting the French automaker Renault on board with the project, the vehicle was officially brought into service in 1917 as the Char Leger Renault FT Model 1917. And please pardon my French through this whole episode, it's as bad or worse than my German. Often you will see it labeled as the FT-17, but the official designation is just Renault FT. The FT ended up being produced in numbers greater than any other World War I tank, with 4,517 being produced. This meant that a large number were in French inventory following the war and would remain so up until 1940, although many of them were sold off to other nations in the meantime. The FT would also be produced outside of France, with several countries making their own version. Most famous of these is probably the US M1917 light tank. Also, Italy had their own, I wouldn't call it a copy. They looked at it, kind of were inspired to create their own improved design, which they called the Fiat 3000. Now, the list of countries that either built or imported FT tanks in the interwar period is extensive, and we'll read them off here really quick. Belgium, Brazil, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Finland, Iran, Japan, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, and Yugoslavia. They saw service in numerous conflicts as well, such as the Russian Civil War, Polish-Soviet War, Chinese Civil War, Rif War, Spanish Civil War, and the Estonian War of Independence. So as you can see, a complete history of the FT and all the countries it was used in, all the wars. That would be an entire video series on its own. So that's why I'm kind of really skipping over a lot of the pre-World War II history of this vehicle. So fast forward to France 1940, since that's the era we're supposed to be talking about. Now, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, September, France and Britain declared war. They had guaranteed Polish security and sort of this was the end of the appeasement era. War was declared, and then basically nothing happened. For the next 7 months, both sides basically stayed on their side of the border. There's some small actions, different things going on, but certainly not a full-scale war on the land. Instead, both sides are sort of building up their strength and wondering what the other's going to do. Now, this period got a couple sort of funny names. In the West, it was called the Phony War. The Germans called it the Sitzkrieg, of course, which is a sort of joke on the Blitzkrieg word. And that all ended abruptly on May 10, 1940, when German forces came crashing into French territory. And this would become one of the most shocking events of the 20th century, as French resistance to the German invasion would last only 7 weeks, resulting in a French surrender on June 25th. Now, a full description of the 1940 campaign is a bit outside the scope of a video series such as this one. So I would recommend that people go online and check out some videos, or better yet, read a book about it if they want to learn more detail. We'll put some recommendations at the end of the video for books. A very brief description of the campaign, though, I'll provide here, and I'll put a map up so people can see what I'm talking about. And the quick version is that the Allies expected the Germans to come storming down through the Low Countries and then head toward Paris, which was sort of their World War I strategy. Now, the Germans' plan, which evolved, there's a whole history of how it changed and it evolved, but the plan they eventually went with was a very smart one, in that it took into account what the Allies thought the Germans was going to do and used it against them. So the real thrust of the German assault was directed through the relatively lightly defended Ardennes forest, and consisted of a majority of the German panzer divisions were in that Ardennes thrust, which was south of where the Allies thought the Germans were actually coming through. So as the Germans did come through the Low Countries, the best of the French and British forces, and primarily a lot of their mechanized forces, rushed forward into Belgium, trying to stop the Germans as far forward as they could, thinking that things are going to eventually settle down into sort of the static trench lines of World War I again. So they want to, be as far forward as they can be. The problem is they're rushing forward. This whole large German force that's moving through the Ardennes is cutting underneath them and working their way all the way to the coast. And very quickly, the French and the British Expeditionary Force find themselves cut off from the rest of France and in real trouble. And so that prompts the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate at Dunkirk, which I think most of you are familiar with, since it was a big movie last summer, I think. And it meant that the cream of the crop of the French army, including a lot of their mechanized forces, are cut off. And so the French quickly try to reorganize, establish a line, but it's too late by that point. Resistance crumbles, the Germans advance toward Paris, and all this despite heroic resistance from individual French units and soldiers. I don't want to imply that a lot of the French didn't fight very bravely, but it just, the strategy, the way everything turned out, it was not in the cards for the French in this particular instance. So that's the overall strategic situation in 1940 in France. Now we want to look at some of the issues pertaining specifically to tank units and to the tanks themselves. Now, the first thing we have to acknowledge is the German Panzer Division played an absolutely key part in the German overall plan and in their success. And the Germans had 10 Panzer Divisions at this point, compared to only 3 armored divisions for the French. So they had a big advantage there, even though the 10 Panzer Division is still a small fraction of the overall German force, which is moving on foot and on hoof. That said, though, those units were critical, and they were critical because they were experienced, well-trained, and well-led. It was not because their tanks were significantly better than those used by the Western Allies in terms of armor, or gunpowder, or whatever. If anything, it's usually the opposite. That said, though, the German Panzer Divisions also had the advantage in that they were not running into the sort of maintenance, training, and logistical issues that the Allies were. The German Panzer Forces have been able to avoid these sort of issues because they've already gone through them all in their previous campaigns. I mean, if you go back and you look at the German records following the invasion of Poland the previous year, they had been complaining about some of the same things that sort of happened to the Allies in 1940. The difference is they're invading Poland, an opponent they're going to beat no matter what, pretty much. And then, also they have the experiences in places like Spain in '36, and Austria, and then, again in Poland. So they've worked out all the kinks, whereas the British and French are trying to learn these sort of basic things about armored warfare and how armored units operate in the worst possible situation, which is up against a better trained enemy that's clearly they're equal or better. Now, one thing you'll see debated quite commonly amongst those interested in World War II tanks is the quality of German versus French tank design in 1940. And it's not unusual to find sources stating that German panzer forces were much more successful than French tank forces in 1940, despite, let's skip all that. Now, as to this notion that the French tanks were significantly better than the German ones in this period, which you hear somewhat times in some sources, I don't agree with that assessment. While in some instances French tanks look better on paper than their German adversaries, particularly in terms of armor thickness or gun size, French tanks suffered from a range of technical deficiencies and design flaws that made them less than effective weapons of war compared to the German tanks of 1940. Of course, when people talk about the supposedly superior French tanks of 1940, they're usually disregarding the FT, which had largely been consigned to reserve status by this point. However, due to shortages of more modern vehicles, at least 8 battalions of FT tanks were still operational in 1940. Now, at the end of the campaign, the Germans captured 1,704 FT tanks, which is a considerable standard by any number. The FT is a small vehicle of about 6 or 7 tons, depending on how you define a ton, and featured a crew of 2, a driver and a gunner/commander. Now, the driver sits in the front of the vehicle, protected by armor plates that swing open to allow him to exit and enter the vehicle. The commander is in the turret, which is armed with a single machine gun or a small cannon. Armor protection is a maximum of 22 millimeters on the turret, with other areas of the tank protected by 16 millimeter or 8 millimeter thick plates. Now, this level of protection was appropriate for a World War I battlefield, where the primary concern was small arms fire, but obviously quite inadequate against the anti-tank weapons of the Second World War. Now, the armor of the FT hull was riveted, and there were 2 different turret designs, one riveted, one made mostly from castings. Now, firepower, as mentioned earlier, was either a single machine gun in a turret or, not both, but either or, a small caliber cannon. Initially, the machine gun arm versions had the French World War I 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun. Now, in 1931, a program was commenced to replace the Hotchkiss with the 7.5mm Rebelle machine gun. That was called the FT Modifié 31. Now, the cannon-equipped version sported the Puteaux, again, pardon my French, SA-18, which is a short-barreled 37mm gun with a relatively low muzzle velocity. Now, this cannon had a semi-automatic breech system. It was capable of about 10 rounds per minute in normal circumstances. Had a simple direct sight with one-time magnification, meaning the target looked about twice as big in the scope as compared to normal vision. Now, this gun was derived from a 37mm French infantry gun that was introduced in 1916. Now, in general, the infantry version of the gun was found wanting in destructive power, being barely adequate for taking out machine gun nests, and generally found inferior to, say, infantry mortars, which replaced it eventually. In tank service, the gun lacked anti-armor capability, being able to penetrate only about 20mm of armor at 500 meters. Now, one interesting side note, in case anybody is wondering how they ended up with 37mm as the barrel diameter figure, this has to do with the 1899 Hague Convention, which stipulated that no shell of less than a pound shall contain an explosive. Now, 37mm was pretty much agreed upon as being the smallest diameter you could create and meet that requirement for an explosive round, and therefore became a standard gun size in several armies as a result. Mobility was provided by a Renault 4-cycle 4.5-liter water-cooled gasoline engine producing a whopping 39 horsepower at 1,500 RPMs. So not a high-power or high-speed engine there. The suspension is a simple vertical spring system, which certainly nothing fancy, but hey, at least it had a suspension, which is not something every World War I era tank could claim. The transmission offered 4 forward speeds and 1 reverse, and top speed was a blistering 5 miles an hour, maybe. Off-road, 1 to 2. Range, about 37 miles, give or take. Now, I had a chance to see one of these tanks up close last year. Actually, it was a USM 1917 model, but very similar. One of the interesting features are these little brass cups on the engine. Now, the purpose of these is you put gas in each one of these and turn the valve, and that would prime the engine. I just thought it was a fun little detail worth sharing, and I had some footage, so I decided to throw that in there. Now, the vehicle had no radio, and vision from inside this vehicle was rather limited, although that was common on later French tanks as well. Now, the commander accessed the vehicle through a hatch in the back of the turret. There was no top hatch through the vision cupola, another feature common on later French tanks that we'll see, and a feature that's kind of problematic. Now, since the FT tanks were in service for a couple decades with numerous countries, many variants exist. However, most of these are not relevant to World War II or to France, so I'm going to skip them. Now, in French service, the most notable variant was the Char Signal, or TSF. TSF stands for Telegraphe Sans Fil, and that was the command variant of the vehicle equipped with a radio. It's worth noting that the Polish Army still had about 70 FT tanks in service in 1939 when the German and Soviet armies invaded. And theirs were not all that much different than the standard French FT version tanks. And most of them, their mechanical condition was so bad by 1939 that they were typically used as static defense structures. But since we didn't discuss the FT in our previous Polish series, I thought I'd mention that now, since that's one of the significant combat uses of the vehicle that we see in the early part of the war is Poland 1939. One other variant that saw combat in World War II was a series of models referred to as the Renault NC. Now, these were FT tanks with improved suspensions intended for export. Now, a few different versions of the NC existed. There was the 1 and the 2. I've also seen some other designations for them. It gets a little confusing. And only small numbers of them would end up in combat. So primarily, there were some that were in Yugoslavia in 1941 that were used against the Germans when they invaded, a very small number. And then some were also exported to Japan, who used them in China in the early 30s. By 1940, the FT was in the process of being replaced in the French Army, but that process was not yet complete, meaning that 8 battalions and 3 companies of FT tanks were still operational, totaling about 536 tanks. Now, the French Air Force also operated a number of FT tanks for airfield security duties. A further 63 FT tanks were stationed in French-controlled Syria and 244 in North Africa. Now, these tanks would later come under control of Vichy France forces after 1940. Now, the French depot again housed about 1,000 FT tanks roughly, many of them essentially derelicts. A lot of them were missing guns, which had been removed for service in newer French tanks. Due to their outdated status, the FT did not see as much combat in the 1940 campaign as most other French tanks. The French High Command largely held these units in reserve due to their relatively fragile mechanical condition. However, there was at least one notable combat action of FT tanks against German forces that I found. At Chateau Thierry, again, pardon my French, the French École des Chars formed an improvised battalion, including a company of FT tanks. Now, this company defended the south side of the Marne River and a key bridge that was defended by a single FT under the command of Cadet de Rouge. On June 10, a German motorized force tried to take the bridge, which resulted in the destruction of 10 German trucks or vehicles by Cadet Rouge before he himself was killed by enemy fire. However, the improvised company managed to hold the Germans on the other side of the river for the rest of the day. Now, later on, Allied forces would encounter FT tanks used by Vichy French forces in North Africa and Syria. Now, these tanks did not pose very strong threats to the Allied forces equipped with modern weapons. Later on, Allied forces would encounter FT tanks used by German forces. Germany, always short on armored vehicles, used FT tanks captured in France for security duty, and a lot of them for airfield defense, so the Luftwaffe used those. Some were also used as static defenses along the Atlantic Wall. Some were known to have been used in the Paris Uprising of August of 1944. Now, the last known use I could find of an FT tank in combat in World War II was in 1945, when the independent tank section of the French garrison at the Hanoi Citadel was overrun by the Japanese. While a revolutionary design when it was introduced in 1917, by 1940, the Renault FT tank was hopelessly obsolete. Its presence on the World War II battlefield had more to do with the fact that so many had been produced and exported around the world in the interwar period that the fact that most people still thought it was... While a revolutionary design when it was introduced in 1917, by 1940, the Renault FT was hopelessly obsolete. Its presence on the World War II battlefield had more to do with the fact that there were just so many had been produced and exported around the world that they were just there. Nobody really thought of it as a viable combat weapon anymore. In relation to the 1940 campaign in France, it played a fairly minor role in the overall situation, having been consigned to reserve status. However, the 536 FT tanks in service still represented almost 10% of the total French tank force. It's fair to say that the FT tank of 1940 was of considerably less value, combat-wise, than even the weakest of the German tanks that it faced in that period, which was the Panzer I. While both were two-man machines with little armor protection or firepower, at least the Panzer I was a reasonably mobile tank capable of moving faster than a walking man. Also, the Panzer I was a much newer vehicle, meaning they were not as mechanically fragile or as worn out as the French FT fleet. Despite being only a fraction of the total French tank force in 1940, the presence of the FT in the French Army inventory gave rise to a myth after the war that France lost because they were equipped with outdated World War I tanks against the Germans who had modern panzers. This myth has largely been replaced by the notion that 1940 French tanks were actually superior to German tanks of the period, and that the German Army won due to better tactics, training, and leadership. Frankly, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Hopefully, this will become clear in future episodes as we look at the rest of the tanks used in the 1940 campaign. For those interested in reading more about the Renault FT, we have several recommendations. The Osprey Vanguard and New Vanguard series are always good starting points, and there are 3 of them that are relevant to this topic, starting with Vanguard 46, the Renault FT light tank, New Vanguard 173, French tanks of World War I, and New Vanguard 209, French tanks of World War II Part 1, all of which are written by Steven Zaloga. As for photo gallery style books on the FT, there is Armor Photo Gallery number 15, French light tank Renault FT, and US 6-ton tank M1917 by Witold Leronowicz. Also there is FT-17 M1917 World War I tanks by David Doyle. For a broader description of French tanks with lots of really nice illustrations, we recommend the Encyclopedia of French Tanks and Armored Vehicles 1914 to 1940 by Francois Valvilliers. For those wanting a more detailed and scholarly look at French tank action in the First World War, we recommend French Tanks of the Great War, Development, Tactics, and Operations by Tim Gale. Now, if you're saying to yourself, that's not a very long list, well, I hate to say it, but there just has not been as much published in English on French World War I or World War II tanks as on those of the other Allied and Axis countries of that period. That said, as we go through the rest of the 1940 French tanks, we will be posting some other book titles as well, so don't worry, there'll be some more recommendations. Anyhow, we hope you enjoyed this first episode of our look at the tanks of the 1940 invasion of France. If you enjoyed this, let us know. Subscribe, please. If you want to give us a little money, financial support, you can do so through our Patreon page, which we'll have a link to in the description. Again, thanks you for watching, and we will catch you on the next one.